replicated in all markets that Facebook and Twitter and Google operate in, because again, the extent of their harm, only they know because they have the data. Civil society on the outside, like we just don't have the computing power to track the level of evidence required to understand, how much harm they've enabled. But that can only be done through third-party processes. And I think being able to ask for human rights impact assessments, being able to ask for human rights assessments is really critical, because many markets were impacted by Cambridge Analytica. They only created accountability around that in a few, and most of whom were only in the global north. And yet, when you think about other democracies that were impacted, India, for example, we are the largest democracy and the largest market in all of these platforms, and they haven't even done the minimum amount of due diligence to address the harm they caused to Indian peoples. So we really are in a situation where we have very lawless, unaccountable actors. And so I think that in many ways, our next steps have to be coordinating our set of asks across all of our different regional contexts to, one, center minorities who often are the canaries in the coal mine about what are not folks, what's not working in the platform, but also to be clear, this problem isn't unique to our individual country. It's actually global in the ways that these organizations are destroying democracy. The other thing that I also really wanted to kind of, flag for people, particularly if you're coming from a context where you're seeing disinformation and hate speech lead to polarization and mass atrocity, is that we need to demand processes from these companies where there are international norms for transparency and observation, particularly in markets that are descending into genocide. And this is very personal for me, because in looking at the way that these companies are approaching moderation and all of these, issues in the Indian context, they are failing every measure of duty of care that you can imagine. And, for folks who don't know a little bit of what's going on in India, last year there was a law that was passed called the Citizenship Amendment Act. This act actually would denaturalize hundreds of millions of Indians and prepare the pathway for the entry of these folks into a network of concentration camps that have never been seen in world history. And it's a playbook that we've seen in Myanmar, and now has been replicated to scale in the Indian context. And what is horrifying is that all of the companies knew that India was at a genocidal risk. As soon as this law passed, which was really kind of the death toll of like the next phase of what would happen, they should have had some sort of proactive genocidal mitigation plan, particularly since civil society was very active in engaging the requirements for that. But guess what? They do not have a plan. And to know that in our market, the lack of their plan has meant human rights defenders are being targeted for their posts. We are seeing takedowns of vulnerable activists' content and handles at a time when they're reporting about mass atrocity and protests. We're also seeing governmental requests for data that are being used to shut down organizations. And when mass atrocity or pogroms occur, they have no moderation plan as to shut down handles or accounts or calls for violence, which means that the violence not only continues, but it's actually amplified by the platform. And that's what I am so deeply concerned about, is that, there is a time when you first begin this advocacy that you have those like rose-colored glasses where it's like, well, if I just get a meeting, maybe I can explain with the companies that this is what's wrong and you just need to change. And then you actually start those meetings, and then those rose-colored glasses literally break into a million pieces because you realize they actually knew everything that you were saying. They actually understood the risks, and they calculated that it was actually, despite the loss of life, despite the cost to democracy, it was still worthwhile for them to profit off of genocide than it would be to do the right thing, than it would be to actually, perform their duty of care in the markets that they've entered. And, of course, I think what's happening in Myanmar and India are the worst case scenarios that you could possibly imagine with the intervention of these corporations into our market. I think we are the canaries in the coal mine for where your communities are at today. Because if they don't care about, over 1 billion lives in the largest market that they have, do you think that they're going to care about any other market? Basically, every one of our lives, every one of our democracies is fodder for them and their profit. And I can say for sure, as someone who has done advocacy with each of these companies, they know. And if they know and they still knowingly engage with that, then that is the problem. And I think that requires a different strategy than simply just collecting evidence. We need to take a structural path that looks at both collaborative regulation, but also global accountability measures. Because the other challenge you have is that, in some contexts, you are going to have healthy democracies that create regulation around these companies that could have global impacts. Like, for example, Germany is one of the only countries that Facebook has conceded to add a regulation related to hate speech. So you can both regulate for their guidelines, but also for German hate speech. And there are ways that it can be amended, but they capitulated because they wanted to be in the German market. If, however, you're someone in Central Europe or in Asia, they will tell you it's not possible. They will say, oh, no, we cannot do that. Our guidelines are sacrosanct. And in fact, they are designed with global measures in hand. They absolutely aren't. They lack the cultural competency in many markets and entered those markets with hundreds of millions of users and still don't have core competencies in languages and issue areas that they need to have to enter safely. So it's really a critical issue for you guys to consider, is that there are ways that we might want to think collaboratively and build relationships across our different country contexts. So we can say, well, let's say in Bosnia, we decide to try to push for this regulation. If we set precedent in Bosnia, could this impact folks, say, in Bulgaria? Could this impact folks in Myanmar? What does this mean for folks in Vietnam? And that's the way that we want to think. We want to think about our cascading choices of external regulation with other markets that may be in regulation averse markets. And those regulation averse markets are because they're dealing with a hostile state that is interested in regulating for their access to human rights defenders' content, for their access to erode the rights, the democratic norms in their countries. So we may not always be able to land on a collective set of asks, but at least if we know where everyone is, we can at least try to stay in each other's lanes. You think about ways we might build wins off of each other, but also know that the company cannot separate us. Because that's the other thing that these companies do, is they want to silo engagement to individuals because they are concerned about people being able to learn and build power. But I think that we actually need to build our collective power with each other at this time, because the stakes for democracy are too severe if we don't. And this is a time in world history when we're seeing so many democracies in crisis, and in part due to these platforms. So when we think about the measures that we're doing, we absolutely need to continue with research. We absolutely need to investigate regulation, but we need to also, mitigate our process of regulation with an understanding that the choices we make in our country may have global ramifications. So we need to have those back channels with valuable global actors that can share what's happening. The other thing I think that's also really important is that our movements for platform accountability must reflect the most vulnerable on our platforms. And I will say that, the thing that was so striking to me about European disinformation is one of the largest ethnic minorities in Europe, the Roma people, don't have a formal advocate with the platforms. And yet, if you talk to Roma people in every single European and Central European country, all they can talk about is Roma targeted disinformation. And in fact, in talking with one Bulgarian activist, you know, they shared this very violent, you know, norm that had now been set up in Bulgaria, where Roma people are routinely called soap, because that was what their bodies were turned into under the Holocaust. So imagine that language being normalized by Facebook. And, you know, if whenever you hear Facebook saying, you know, oh, we have AI classifiers, we know what we're doing, soap is a word that would very clearly not be seen as a slur. But anyone who knows Roma people, anyone who's in, you know, Bulgaria, who knows that slur, knows exactly what they're talking about. And that's what I really want to point to is their failure of duty of care is both in the lack of competency, both in terms of the response of not having minorities at the table, and also not taking a structural response to these problems, but forcing civil society to deal with this piecemeal. So we're going to work on this one account that got taken down, or this one thing. But to be honest, civil society isn't paid to be their unpaid moderators. We are here to create accountabilities and preserve democracy as much as we can in these very delicate and grave times. And we cannot do that when we have wolves like these companies destabilizing our democratic dialogues. And that's why the time to act is now. So I would like to pass it back to you, Tijana, because I think that, you know, hopefully these remarks kind of help open up a landscape of conversation that the other speakers can then add and build into.
Oh, plenty. Thank you so much. That was really invaluable. And really the point that you made about really thinking about what you do here and how it affects some other place in the world is super important, because I think there is some sense of certainty in your democracy. Probably it has been shaken for everyone in the past few years, but I think it has been, you know, present in certain countries in the global north or in the west, or like whichever classifiers you want to use, that you, when you think about regulation and you think about what impact may it have on citizens and on human rights, which is quite different from contexts where the government is your key, you know, oppressor and the place where your primary danger comes from. So this is something that I would like to turn over to Eliska now, because you're in Brussels, and I think you have this perspective of like what it looks like from a supranational entity like the European Union, and what are there these considerations when the EU bodies or the, you know, the civil society that kind of orbits around the EU bodies and tries to advocate there or tries to, you know, lobby there and make some impact? How are these issues taken into consideration? First of all, of course, how it impacts your citizens and you know, the nations that are in the EU. Then the rest of us who are kind of like around the borders, they're quite frequently not really seen by either the tech companies themselves or the potential regulators, but then also these other parts of the world that may, you know, feel the consequences of acts being, you know, developed or accepted by you know, this dance between the EU and the companies.
Hello, and thank you very much for an excellent question. There is so much to unpack, so I will really try to keep my answer not too lengthy, not probably brief, but in some margins. And thank you very much for having me. For those who don't know me, my name is Eliska. I work as a Europe policy analyst for organization Access Now, which is a global human rights organization that protects, that defends and extends digital rights of users at risk. That's the exact quote and description of our mandate. And there are many things to say about Access Now. We have policy teams operating in several world regions, and our conference RightsCon has already been mentioned by the excellent keynote speaker of this evening. So that's one of the biggest digital rights conferences that Access Now organize on a yearly basis. I lead our content governance work at Access Now, and exactly all these issues that were brought up lie in the core of what civil societies deal with on a regular basis. For a long time, we've been advocating for turning attention of policymakers to business models of very large online platforms that actually have the power to amplify potentially harmful content, whether that's disinformation, but also categories of illegal content and hate speech, which is the most complicated category of user-generated content, as there are forms of hate speech which can be actually legal and at the same time still cause societal harm or having discriminatory impact and silence vulnerable or underrepresented groups. From the Brussels perspective and from the EU perspective, many of you are probably aware of these ongoing legislative reform that actually seeks to tackle all these issues that were already raised. And it's the first time maybe when the legislators seem to listen to opinions of various stakeholders, including civil societies, when we kept asking for legislation that would finally focus on processes that these big platforms deploy their operations, instead of focusing only on certain categories of illegal or potentially harmful content and illegal contact online. This legal reform is called Digital Services Act, which landed and was launched on the 15th of December, and it was anticipated proposal. We were waiting for the actual draft for 2 years. We've been preparing for DSA for already 2 years in advance, creating coalition with civil societies and trying to really formulate our recommendations for legislator in the most possible operational and practical way. And of course, the main driving force behind our work is user and users' fundamental rights and freedom. So we've been asking and pushing for recommendations that actually empower user, that returns control back to the user, but also that we will finally see those due diligence requirements in place. So meaningful transparency within the operations of platforms that they deploy for content moderation or content curation, but also being able to mitigate the risk that stems from their operations and that ultimately can impose societal harm. Now, I don't particularly like the term harm, and I won't go into the details today why this is a problematic terminology, because as we know, each time when a vague terminology is being used by a legislation, it creates incredible space for the abuse. But maybe I would also like to reflect on a few points that were raised during the keynote. And I think what we need to bear in mind is that indeed we as civil societies and the majority of civil societies in Brussels do advocate for that human rights centric regulation that will finally establish the new set of human rights responsibilities for platforms that they ultimately have to comply with. But many of those regulations and the way how they will turn out and how they influence human rights also depends, and it's directly linked to the state of rule of law, democracy, and the respect for human rights that the country actually has. We also saw a very bad legislation being drafted inside of the European Union. And for many years, European Union countries set up a wrong precedents, laws that were actually relying on non-transparent swift removals of the content under crazy short timeframes where no judicial oversight or transparency or the access to effective remedy was actually possible. These laws still exist in Europe. Some of member states of the European Union continue legislating despite of harmonization effort happening at the EU level. I don't probably have to explain to anyone what's currently happening in Poland. We have great experts on this code looking at you, Krzysztof. Regarding the Polish proposal on platform governance, Hungary is also planning to issue its own legislative proposal. And these are far from good examples of how to actually regulate platforms and how to establish those due diligence safeguards. And DSA is indeed very, very progressive, even though it's a long way ahead of us. And this is just the beginning. And there are a lot of imperfect solutions within DSA, but it's a good start. And maybe the final point, and there is so much more to unpack, but I will give space to other speakers. NetzDG in Germany was mentioned, and NetzDG is indeed the first law that attempts to respond to online hate speech and imposes direct obligations on platforms. But it's also the law that actually repeats the same mistake. That means that it actually shifts the obligations and positive obligation of states to protect human rights of individuals that should belong to a state according to the constitutional and human rights law on private platform, who then carries with those obligations in very non-transparent way and with no public scrutiny. NetzDG inspired plenty of other legislative proposals all around the globe. An organization called Justitia nicely monitored and gathered that evidence in their report that came out in 2020. And I think their conclusion was that around 25 countries around the globe adopted intentionally or somewhere were influenced by NetzDG proposal. If such law ends up in hands of authoritarian regimes, it can cause incredible damage. And this is something we also have to keep in mind. But I definitely agree with the first keynote in a way as well, that we often see platforms actually following some level of due diligence if there is a regulatory pressure and if there is something serious consequences imposed on their future operations. And especially in the global south and in the countries where often one large online platform is the only version of internet local population know and can use, their responsibilities are even bigger in that regard. And we saw and reported and monitored so many negligent behavior that indeed resulted in a severe consequences. Myanmar is often brought up as one example, but even this summer, after actually reminding to one of those very large online platforms that they are currently operating in a very risky situation, and it wasn't only civil societies, but it was also former Special Rapporteur David Kay, and this was the case of Ethiopia. Again, we saw the platform repeating same mistakes, not enough moderators that would actually speak the local languages and that would understand the local context, and many other measures that were not actually implemented by this platform. And again, it was absolutely negligent behavior. So as I said, we advocate for the human rights-centric regulation. We think that there is a need for it. We have high hopes, but there is a long way ahead of us still. Thank you.
Thank you, Eliska. I would like to just kind of go further from your point and Thenmozhi's point as well, that actions have consequences that are potentially not foreseen when taken, such as the one that you mentioned with NetzDG. Like if it's just like copied and pasted elsewhere, it can become a really powerful tool of additional oppression for people. So to turn to you, Alexey, coming from, like we discussed just before we started how you actually had an event today of an oppressive move against a platform by a government where you are. So what would be the forum, in your opinion, to discuss this? Like Thenmozhi mentioned, there is a huge need for discussion to take place in a context that kind of takes all of this into consideration. What do you think that forum could be for civil society, for governments, for bodies like the EU bodies, and for the tech companies to make most sense and to have the most positive impact when it comes to protection of human rights and freedom as well?
Wow, that's not an easy question.
A nice one.
Well, I think that, I would agree with Eliska about the human rights center approach, and that would be the short answer. Although I would have a bit more complicated answer and comment, because Anya Kuliberda said that we will not provide simple answers today, and I'd like to add a bit of nuance to the situation. And I think that I was surprised that Thenmozhi didn't mention actually like a more fundamental issue with the platforms, is that I call it the so-called Zubov's argument, that they extract behavioral data and take it and process it and actually use most of it value for its own reason, and they design their platforms in order to be addictive. And one of the things that we see is what Thenmozhi said, is that they are by design polarizing. And I mean, what do we do usually with addictive things. I would also propose on one hand that maybe we need to look maybe at platforms not like heroin, but maybe like Coca-Cola, you know, and I know that in Poland it's a big issue that they just introduced a tax on Coca-Cola, but you know, when we listen to the stories about Norway and we say how expensive the soft drinks are, it usually sounds like a good thing, because we know that Coca-Cola actually causes diabetes. It causes a whole bunch of different diseases, you know, and at the same time you still can buy it in the shop, and still you can see the advertisements with the Santa Claus in the Coca-Cola colors, and so on and so on. So it's basically a part of life, the addictive part of life that we have to tolerate. But nevertheless, you know, why not tax it and actually treat it and say it out loud, say it by, like, call it by the name, that it's addictive thing, you know. And so this is one thing I believe, and I think that we need just to simply to address this addictive design of at least of Facebook and any other platforms that use the certain design patterns out there. That would be my first point. My second point would be that one perspective, obviously, if when a platform comes to an established democracy, but there is a very different perspective when, you know, you would have like a country like Russia with a rather short 9-year window after the fall of the Soviet Union. And then you would have to basically, when the some democracy, some proto-democracy, chaotic democracy was installed, and then like in 2000s it was, you know, like being deinstalled, and you know, some authoritarian or hybrid regime was built back, and which involved actually that a shrinking space of discussion, where the platforms actually brought a lot of freedom and a lot of new abilities to the people to discuss, to actually talk to each other, that they couldn't anywhere else, and where they also could organize. And it had a huge liberating value back then, and still even now. You know, you take down Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, and you would have a significantly worse democratic situation, significantly worse situation for civil society. And this is why I actually ask, I mean, is there causal relation between the rise of the platforms and the decline of the democracies? Because there are also a lot of other things happening. You know, we cannot just say that, oh, you know, like democracy grew, the platforms grew, democracy went down. I mean, like, obviously there is a complicated relationship between those two things. But I mean, what is happening right now? Obviously, the authoritarian government uses and misuses any attempt to platform regulation to actually break the internet even more. I mean, what we can see today is the Russian governing body said that, well, we've sent 28,000 requests to Twitter, and Twitter ignored all of them. And there are 3,000 links on Twitter, including child pornography, teenage suicide, and so on and so on. And Twitter really doesn't care, you know, like they are mentioning some bogus action that called teenagers to commit suicide, and that Twitter ignored their requests to remove it. And therefore they say, okay, we're going to use our DPI tools, deep packet inspection, that is currently installed as a part of the sovereign internet, because, you know, how do you enforce the internet? You have to have your own infrastructure, and Russia already did that. And the slippery slope that we can see is that other governments trying to enforce the same kind of ideas, you know, might say, oh, okay, like, let's also, you know, like, install a hammer on our internet, you know, and let's try to prosecute this, because, you know, the governments don't, the platforms don't listen to us. And what you have here, you have about 48,000 autonomous systems being affected by the Twitter slowdown, because there is no good way of actually enforcing it like this. And this is one thing. This is just what happened today. But also you have completely crazy propagandists that are taken down by Facebook, and what the government says, like, how can you remove the perfectly respectable citizens from our platforms? You have to be punished. You have to bring the propagandists back. Or the Facebook Council, the Content Council, actually says that when they issued a decision recently that one person asked another, "Are you a bot?" And this person has been punished for this. Like it's usually because the Russian Facebook is flooded by Facebook Twitter, but who gets punished? The activist actually who asks whether a person is a bot, and Facebook consider this an insult. So we can see that the regulation is double-edged sword, and we might not want to completely use it like Thenmozhi offers. I mean, because it can backfire, and it can backfire much worse than actually maybe a lack of regulation like Thenmozhi proposes. So I don't have any good answer. I think like most of you do. I just want to see that there is a lot of nuance to the situation, and what is black and white, very distinct, like that you can, like see distinct where good or bad is not the same in certain other parts of the world. Thank you.
Yeah, that's definitely, I think we're on the same page when it comes to that, all of us. That one thing, like what is a space of freedom for you, maybe could be a space of oppression for someone else. Or even in the same context, I think a very good example that Thenmozhi gave is like, how do Roma people feel on Facebook, for example? How do Roma people feel? I mean, there's racism against Roma people in literally every European country. I'm assuming Russia is no exception, So maybe the freedom space for people who are trying to be critical of the government and to express their free thoughts there could be also a space of oppression for someone who is a minority within that context. So it's super complex and very nuanced, and I don't think we're seeing it black and white at all. There's a really good metaphor that I like about the especially social networks and similar platforms. If you look at them as an industry, they create these wonderful things that provide you with the opportunity to be creative, to connect to other people, to maybe be critical, to maybe have freedom of speech that you don't have in your oppressive context. But as any other industry, they also create some sort of pollution, with the product that they give, that needs to be regulated in some way, as real pollution is. So the standards for that's the question I think that is most interesting for everyone. Is like, where are those standards set, and how to set them in a way that takes into account all of these different contexts. I mean, to this, I would like to, the time is running so fast, but I would like to ask Thenmozhi again, like, what do you think the forum is for, like, all these so differing perspectives to come together to discuss this? What would that be? I mean, in real life, what would that be? Would it be someone that would be organized, I know, by the United Nations with the, invitations sent out to relevant civil society groups and actors, and this is something that kind of is hard for me to imagine, like, where does this conversation take place in order for it to have real impact?
I think I think in some ways we need to have multilateral stakeholder conversations with existing international institutions. So, even though the UN can be flawed, I think the UN is one place that we might be able to have certain conversations. So for example, there's the Office of Genocide Prevention at the UN level. I feel like we could easily see a very powerful multilateral stakeholder conversation of countries that are either facing mass atrocity, or who are at that tipping point in terms of genocide, coming together to create a set of international recommendations to the platforms with the Office of Genocide for the response to the corporations to address this. I also think because of the nature of how these companies approach moderation, they treat huge regions of the world as if they are one country. So Africa is not a continent, it's an office, right? For that incredible, huge amount of countries and people. And so I feel like there could be stakeholder relationships for the region that then could influence greater equity and approaches to human rights questions across that. So I feel like being able to create side events and also using places like RightsCon and other international gatherings to build those regional tractions is really important. And then I also think establishing a body of record, because I fundamentally think that these corporations are so corrupt that I don't think that we're going to achieve long-lasting change through our back channels. I think this is fundamentally going to come down to regulation, both international and at the national level, and possible litigation, because they are not willing to pivot the course while they're seeing democracies descend into mass atrocity and genocide. And I think, Alexey, to your point earlier, the thing that's really hard for them to pivot is their entire business model is based on surveillance capitalism. So they would actually literally have to take time to invest in another business model, and also, have that kind of, reckoning of moral conscience to recognize I make money off of genocide. This is exactly every single market that I'm going into that is starting to see that descent. I'm responsible. And I can say this, for sure for Facebook, this is true, because the first mass atrocity related to social media happened in India in 2013 with the Musafnagar riots. And with these riots, a video went viral on Facebook and WhatsApp, and it led to the murder of several Muslim and caste-oppressed people, and then mass rapes and the destruction in homes of minorities. Now, normally when you have a level of crisis that big, a company would pause, do a human rights assessment, and then say, oh, maybe I need to do something different. They didn't do that. We know what Sheryl Sandberg does. She leans in. So what did they do? They leaned into the largest elections in the world. Just think about that. Mass atrocity just happened. And they were like, well, let's get into the election business. Great. And then they went into the elections business and they emboldened far-right actors into power. And then their platforms then further emphasized the power of those bad actors. And the thing that's so wild, and I really want people to understand like how lawless these companies are in the Indian context, in reports from the Wall Street Journal, Facebook has admitted that they do not moderate far-right voices because they are worried about blowback to their staff and their offices. So just think about that. These companies are basically saying, we don't really want to do our jobs because it could actually hurt our offices and people, and we can't ensure their safety. So if these companies can't even ensure the safety of their teams and their offices, what on earth are they doing with the safety of the users? Zero, zilch, I can tell you that. So my sense is that, to your question, Tijana, we need to be able to better understand our pain points and the violence that we're navigating as researchers and civil society stakeholders. Some of those things are back channel conversations. We can't always be open about what is happening in our context. So there's a lot of trust that needs to be built by trusted stakeholders like yourself. But also, I think that we need to use international mechanisms to think about regulatory practices, and also understand that regulation can be a two-edged sword when the state is also one of the bad actors. And that's going to be different for every single region and country that is represented. And so as long as civil society is aligned on the big picture of what's required for regulation, then I think that we can start to make some progress. And we're seeing the most progress in the EU. So I think that there's a lot that can be done there, but I just mostly want to embolden people to be ambitious. Think about the fact that these kids that developed Facebook, they did it in the college bedroom to think about the fact that they wanted to find a way to find hot chicks, right? That was the impetus of Facebook. Is that the cultural competency required to create a global platform, that's involved in democracies around the world? Absolutely not. You also have to think about the fact that some of the investments that went into Facebook came from the CIA. Some of their first growth money came in from that process because they wanted a tool to map social networks.
To the
So
point
the
that,
DNA is not, the DNA of these platforms is not about what we're here for: democracy, transparency, and thinking about how we would, want to be stronger together. It's really about profit. It's really about tracking and surveillance capitalism, and a complete zero in terms of cultural competency.
Thanks. But this is something that kind of, it's really easy to map out the flaws and the weaknesses of the tech companies, but they're not going away. They're here, and they're definitely here to stay, and they're going to stay in these large markets as much as they're going to stay in the small markets. So that's kind of a why I'm saying this is, I mean, you can do a lot of research and prove that point over and over again. We're still going to be stuck with the issue, what to do with it, like how to engage with that, how to engage with all these flaws from the perspective of civil society, how to engage from the perspective of democratic government, or from a perspective of someone who tries to kind of like protect that heritage of good governance, democracy, and human rights. So Eliska, you were going to comment on something that was said.
Thank you. So I have several comments to make, also in connection to this great contribution that we just heard. So first of all, I couldn't agree more on issues and the need for instance, conducting a proper human rights impact assessment before these companies even enter the market, especially in countries that have been actually subjected to ongoing historical violent conflicts. And these are actually all the issues that were even raised by the United Nations, also in the connection to Myanmar and the Special Rapporteur, whether on freedom of expression and information, or also the special mission that was actually investigating the situation in Myanmar. Now, there was a lot mentioned about that we need to actually have that access to data and the data harvesting business models and capital and surveillance capitalism. I guess that's one of those novel aspects that DSA or the European regulation brings in, but it's also something that civil societies have been asking for a long time. And I could flag the work of many, but Algorithm Watch, for instance, based in Berlin, did very good work on so-called data access framework, which obliges companies to make some set of data available so we can actually understand what happens on these platforms, and then directly draw the connection between the spread of certain categories of content to the societal phenomena and different crises of democracy that we are witnessing and experiencing, because we know that it's happening, but we still do not understand the exact mechanism. And because the researchers have usually access to a very limited set of data, so they can of course point out and prove certain issues, but we are still missing, the complete picture. There are then other aspects of this legislation that is coming up, and I'm intentionally for now staying away from the details, such as online targeting or online advertisement and content recommender systems that are responsible for personalization of user-generated content. DSA kicks off the process in a right direction, but it doesn't do enough in that context. But also, I would like to probably mention one potential solution that we are still exploring as civil societies in cooperation with techie activists, together with the European Commission and other actors who are interested in this topic, and that's the issue of interoperability of very large online platforms, and also how to actually control and possibly prevent similar online gatekeepers as Digital Market Act, a second piece of legislation proposed by the European Commission as this part of this big reform package, seeks to tackle and calls them. So what the interoperability could do in practice, it could on one hand encourage a fair competition and maybe encourage smaller media platforms or social media platforms to be created in the future. The one where communities can actually feel safer, where they can directly influence the terms and conditions that these platform then follows in practice. It could also possibly create a possibility of, let's call them for now third plugins, when you as a user can stay on Facebook, but you can still choose who and how curate your content and why and what parameters are being used. And you then actually have an active choice. You are not, locked in, and you are not being subjected to that background manipulation that happens, whether as a part of content recommender system or online advertisement models. So this is something, if you ask what we can do and what we should do, ultimately, I think that the answer lies in how we will tackle the dominance, not only the dominance in the competition meaning of that word, but also the control over public sphere that these private actors actually gained and hold over us.
Thank you, Eliska. I was also going to mention that, like, the thing that we are talking about most often here is content and content moderation and how to regulate that, how to regulate hate speech, how to regulate threats, how to regulate disinformation. But there's a lot of other things that can be regulated as well that are also subject of this conversation. Like, how do you regulate their monopolist ways that are currently quite obvious, I think, and that don't really need to be, defended, that there is a monopoly from like different companies in different areas. How do you regulate data protection? How do you balance out privacy with transparency? These are very also complex issues. For example, if you want to provide, as someone coming from like my primary interest in social networks is research, I'm often frustrated with the lack of transparency because they don't provide enough research data. On the other hand, that same research data could put someone in jeopardy if they did provide it as openly and transparently as my people would like. So these are also topics to discuss when it comes to regulation. Alexey, I don't know if you saw my private message. I was going to ask you to elaborate. You did on this point where you said that regulation of potentially violent content and groups should rather be trusted to the government. So could you elaborate on that, if I got that correctly?
Well, I think that a lot of issues that I could hear today towards the platforms, are not the issues of platforms per se, that there are a lot of social issues, that the society and the government should actually solve. The fact that there are lots of racism in Central and Eastern Europe against Roma, that's not the issue that appeared only with the presence of social platforms. These issues were there because the societies are bad. They ignore those issues. They are trying to hide these under the carpet, and now they are emerging. The issues of racism, they are emerging also. Yes, because the social platforms do play not only this role of the addictive, polarizing structure, but also the role of a megaphone, the something that creates that amplifies the signal. And I think that, but still, you cannot amplify a zero there. So I believe that a lot of things like white supremacy, like racism, like regular racism, you cannot just blame on platforms. But and I think that this is one thing, and we cannot just say that, oh, that's all platforms' fault. But I think that having this said, I think that the other thing is that we need to pay close attention to the amplifier roles, where the role of the amplifier was huge in terms of any other events. And I think that this requires actually some creativity, not just let's make them greatly increase their spending on heavy guards, on lots of moderators. No, I think that what I would suggest, that we should not forget that the environment where we talk while using the platforms is constructed. It's it's person-made, human-made, and therefore it allows for a lot of creativity. And I think what I really like what Eliska said, that actually what she offers is there are creative technology solutions to technology problems. And I think that one thing would be like a bit of more openness, or imposing openness on certain parts of the architecture, making it interoperable. Another thing what I like, what we recently discussed is, and I will be quoting another bad actor, well, maybe not so bad, but Google, in introducing Flock, federated learning of cohorts. And what I like about this concept is, first, and also speaking of research, it allows for k-anonymity. The fact, the quality of data that allows market use, so there we are not destroying completely, even though it's still, like, in terms of surveillance capitalism, this is some like debatable thing, like we do not destroy the business model completely, but we create a lot of safeguards on actually how the data is used, and actually we allow for research. And this is a completely mathematical solution to a number of problems. It doesn't solve all the problems, but it solves a lot of them. And I think that we should also think of solutions like this, where we actually, can solve stuff, first, one on the society part, on the government, on the old school traditional physical part, and on the other one, using the creative technical solutions, and using such qualities as openness and interoperability, and also stuff that can be brought to us with the use of cryptography and mathematics. So I think that would be my point.
Thank you, Alexey. I mean, yeah, that's definitely the case. The social networks did not invent racism or intolerance or anything like that. But I don't think they only amplify it. I think they contribute to development of new ways that it expresses itself, and not just expresses itself, but also like the way that it influences the content of it and the channels of transmission and the intensity and all of these things. There was a similar discussion when it comes to journalist safety. And someone had a point very similar to this, that this is just like another way, another place where it happens, but it's not the same, because otherwise, before these channels, you would need to put a real effort into intimidating someone. You would need to find where they live. You would need to find like which streets they walk, in order to place a threat to those people. Now you don't really need. You have a very express highway shortcut to do these things. So I think this also requires a new way of thinking about it, and probably some of it, a part of that solution are the things that you mentioned, which are kind of computational, but definitely don't rule out the human factor in all this. Okay, so Anna suggested, and I agree, that since Elizabeth, am I right? Yes, Elizabeth, you made a lot of good points and a lot of questions. Maybe we could like get your voice to kind of summarize the things that you wanted to ask or comment, rather than just have Anna read them or me read them to other people. Are you up for that?
I can join you via audio. Sorry, I've got a terrible internet connection here. Sorry, I have been pinging people with questions.
We can hear you great.
You can, fantastic. Yes. I'm using my hotspot, actually. We've had some bad weather here in Poland, in the north of Poland at least. I had brought up some questions with a couple different folks, and then also on the main panel, mainly because I've been on Clubhouse having a lot of discussions about this very topic. We just had one last night about misinformation. And so some of the questions that came up out of that, because I was mainly in the room with folks coming out of cybersecurity and Silicon Valley, is what other mechanisms can we use to achieve the same result, looking outside of governmental systems and enforcement, which is usually a very slow, laborious process. And then we're getting tied into free speech questions, monopolization of those efforts by these quote unquote bad actors. So what Russia is doing, what Poland is doing, what Hungary is doing. And some of the things that have come up are alternative solutions of using this end user curation, which is something that Eliska had brought up, and different models for that, as well as platforms themselves bringing in AI assisted moderation. And the most recent one that we had actually as part of our club on Clubhouse was one called ChatSite, where they're actually trying to increase the truth power of different platforms by changing the algorithms.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Can you repeat what it's called? I did not hear it well.
It's called ChatSite.
ChatSite.
ChatSite, yes.
Okay.
And there's other models of that, and there's more securitized models. There's one out of Estonia called Sentinel, I believe. And there's a few others in terms of monitoring hate speech. ChatSite is unique, and I'm not plugging them. I just think their idea is quite interesting, and the discussion was quite interesting, of this question of how we moderate truth, bringing in, or how we moderate hate speech, for example, is the more pertinent question, of bringing in the end user for that discussion. So you're incorporating part of this sort of Reddit model of the community monitors itself, and also bringing in the goals of the platform. So you actually don't have as much direct moderation being done by the platform. You don't have really any moderation being done by a government entity. You have an incentivized structure for self-moderation to create a better product that then is built on an AI backbone. And the person we talked to, who I'm happy to provide that kind of linked information, he could provide that structure or the overview of that structure in more detail. But I'm curious about looking at what our solutions are for attacking these kind of issues to get the outcome we want. What other issues or what other options exist beyond just regulatory options? And I'll leave it there. Sorry, I feel like I've taken quite a bit of your time, and there's far more experienced people on the panel that I would love to hear from.
Would someone like to take the last point to comment on it? Okay, the weird Zoom thing is happening, which is, I think, quite normal.
I think that, beyond regulatory actions, I think that it's important that we are educating the public and also creating documentation towards the impacts of harm. And that's actually one of the tragedies I see in terms of the colonial nature of these technologies. For example, when you talk to people who are American activists on this issue, they can take a meeting and get a meeting with people who ultimately are in their own country, but they're never required to bring data. In fact, like when I was talking to Color of Change, they were like, we just had to bring 1 or 2 posts and that's it. And they still obviously had to do a lot more work. This is not to diminish the incredible advocacy and power building they've done on this issue, but to have a seat at the table didn't require technology or forensics or cybersecurity. They had a right to bring it to the table because this company is incorporated in the United States. Civil rights is a respected norm, and they were able to come to that place. Global South organizers are not given that same privilege. In fact, most global South civil society organizations would never be taken credibly by the platforms unless they came to a data set. So that meant they had to have a significant ability to do forensics research, collect data, not just anecdotally, but also with some form of quantitative measure. Because again, like what you were saying, Tijana, the problem with these platforms is that they are able to embolden hate speech in ways through algorithms that were computationally impossible without them. We would not see the rapid, movement of disinformation and hate speech if they themselves did not have a business model that required, content to move that quickly in the ways that it does, and for their lack of regulation and enforcement related to bot networks and other things that violate their own policies, but actually make all of our lives a living hell. So I think that, in some ways, I personally do not want civil society in the long term to be in the habit of doing things that are actually part of the duty of care of these corporations. Frankly, if like one of these companies just allocated the budget that they spend on their cereal bar to actually seriously addressing the issue of disinformation and hate speech with the required investment and accountability that's required, maybe we'd have a different conversation. But this is not their priority. Their priority is not about safety, because the bad actors that they're emboldening are actually some of their most profitable. And that's a very painful thing to think about, that some of the top influencers in many of our countries are genocidal hate speech actors. And I think that is a reckoning that they're going to have to deal with, that is really their burden to bear, because they're the ones that profited off of this, you know. And in the United States, you can look at the way that they emboldened Trump in so many different ways, over and over and over again. They emboldened him, they emboldened his electoral campaign, they empowered all of his like conservative followers when they were saying anti-Semitic content. When there was even a point where they were talking about Antifa, which was an obsession of the far right, you know, of like, you know, progressive left and, you know, anti-fascist. They even allowed an image of Antifa being linked to a Holocaust symbol through their paid advertisement process. And the only reason it was taken down was because of civil society. So I really want us to, you know, maybe not think of this as simply as, you know, of ways where we can deal with this, where we're doing the work of the platform. This is the platform's responsibility. And outside of there being measures of accountability, we need measures of reparation. Because there are people who are never coming back, who've been murdered, who've been lynched, who've been the targets of these violence, that are never coming back. You know, and I think that's really how we have to be thinking about the severity of what's happened right now.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I feel inappropriate for smiling while you were like going into that point. I was smiling because the other absurdity of the relationship of for example, of, I don't know, Donald Trump and the right wing, you know, followers that he has with the social network platforms is quite, I mean, it would be funny if it was not scary, because he started as their baby. Basically, they made it possible for him to become, I mean,
Yes.
after the television, of course, to become what he has become, only to end up in the mess that we saw 2 months ago with these like huge hostile sentiments being expressed against the platforms that have finally decided to actually enforce on their own terms of service, which is another thing that is a very important point that you mentioned. We are seeing a lot of conversations happening now, driven by this resentment, mostly of the right wing, you know, political spectrum, saying that they're being censored and that they're being like they're being like stifled, that the right of freedom of speech is being stifled, only because the platforms have decided to enforce on a fraction of the standards that they have set themselves, but have not chosen to follow until now. And it's really like a bit of a, you know, we are having a wrong conversation about, is this infringing on someone's freedom of speech, because these are the terms that you actually agreed on when you enter those platforms, but you expected them not to be enforced. And this is, I think, a huge part of a lot of these problems that we have mentioned today. Eliska, I'm sorry, you were unmuted for a second there, so can you sorry, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I was muted all the time though.
Oh, okay,
no worries. No, I actually just wanted to take a floor on two things. First of all, there was a comment made about Flock currently deployed by Google. I would be very cautious about saying that Flock is actually human rights or privacy friendly type of technology, even though it's being indeed promoted that way by Google. It is in a view of civil societies, and Electronic Frontiers Foundation recently wrote a very good piece on it, and we will be probably responding in the future from more privacy than techie angle on this. But Flock is basically a new form of tracing of online users, which indeed doesn't necessarily use something that we call a unique identifier to identify that user, but it literally, through machine learning systems, categorize users into different cohorts based on their behavior. So it literally creates the behavioral profile, and then it puts you to the group with the similar behavior. These profiles are then being, I think, updated on weekly basis. This is a very general explanation. And indeed that AI, that machine learning system behind it is very effective, but it's actually even more harmful form of how online users then are being tracked, because it is not only about, like, privacy protection is not only about information that directly identifies you, but also about information that make you identifiable. And inferred data can be extremely dangerous category of data on basis of which platform can learn a lot of deeply personal information about you, from your political conviction to your sexual orientation and so on and so forth. So I wouldn't speak about FLOG as a human rights friendly or privacy friendly technology. I would actually say it's the exact opposite of that. And then maybe just the final point. I definitely agree with the final remarks that were made by a keynote speaker. But maybe let's not forget that ultimately the monopoly of violence, that means the capacity to go and do a major violent action against the criticism and dissent in the country, is still in hands of states. Platforms hold significant responsibility for the way how our how our opinions are being shaped, and we still need to understand more about those mechanisms. But this is something that still belongs to states. So I just wanted to emphasize that this is something important to remember. Thank you.
Thank you, Eliska. And I would like to ask, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Ruchir, right? To also, if he's willing, summarize the points, because he has also made a lot of comments and questions. So we have Anna. Do we have like a few minutes more? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for all these comments and broadening the perspective through which I've been looking at this situation. There were a lot of comments along the way, and they have been answered through already via the follow-up answers and stuff. There was one point that Thenmozhi you made about the regulations at the international level, and UN being one of the body that could enforce them. But so I have two questions there. One, Facebook is trying to do a global watchdog of experts who would moderate the content. There will be a law, there will be a code, and then they have like a former president of Sweden, I guess. If somebody should fact check me on that, that's fine. Would that something that you consider effective? Number one. And second, even the UN's effectiveness, considering that they depend on money from other countries, and other countries have lobbies, which basically lobbies are coming, money is coming from the companies and so on and so forth. So it's kind of like, I don't know, catch-22 situation. We think companies should self-moderate. Facebook is trying to do that. I don't believe it for a second. They would be having their own court, jury, and decision maker. And then UN is, again, not very effective.
I think that we are holding a lot of imperfect stakeholder processes at a time when we have literally no other options. That's the problem. You know, when you think about what's happening in the Indian context, there's no process that can hold what's happening with the crisis there. So the only option people are hoping for is international processes. I would never say that they're perfect. I would never say that they're what we need, but we need to strengthen them at a time when we're seeing national democracies fall apart. Now, in terms of your question about Facebook, and there's Facebook's oversight board. Is that what you were speaking to, or were you speaking about something? I mean, I think that there are excellent people on the Facebook oversight board. I still do not have faith that the oversight board is going to address what are actual structural problems at the company. Again, what they're doing is they're trying to establish precedent by one post at a time, but its fundamental business model is flawed and generates profit out of hate and genocide. That's not something the Facebook Oversight Board is going to effectively maneuver. They might make decisions like, should Trump be online? Oh, should we not have this Islamophobic post? And ideally one after the other creates a ladder of precedent, but the core of the companies are rotten, you know? And also like right now they're only looking at takedowns, things that have been removed, you know, and they're not looking at bad actors. And this is something we haven't even spoken about, is that even how they identify a bad actor, there's no transparency about, you know? So their primary bad actors that they're concerned about in the world are Muslim bad actors. But as we know, across many of our different countries, there are many, many domestic actors that don't fall under the umbrella of extremists in that category, but they're refusing to categorize them as that because, again, they make money because they're some of their prime influencers. So this is where international stakeholder processes can be useful. And, you know, again, I really, I feel like there are great people on the Facebook Oversight Board. I think that their mandate doesn't cover what's actually urgently needed at the companies. And these, you know, these flawed, limited international stakeholder processes are one step for us building what we need. And we may need to build others. You know, that's fundamental. You know, like even thinking about, you know, I remember having a conversation with someone from Germany whose focus was on elections monitoring and social media, and they're trying to create international standards for that. But think about how wild it is that we have an elections entity like Facebook and Twitter operating in our elections, and no one is in the moderation room when they're making calls related to political party conversations. It's completely opaque. How on earth, particularly in an era of digital campaigning, which, you know, in this period right now with COVID is even more pertinent for all of us, how on earth do we allow an American corporation to have such a critical role in so many different global elections, and there's not a single monitor inside their rooms? That's like bananas, right? Like the fact that we allowed that there's no regulation, that there's no international norms or practices, that shows how far the technology has outpaced the law. And we need to really reconcile that, because that gap of illegality has really created a culture of impunity where bad actors have really just gone roughshod, you know.
I think that's a really excellent point for the wrap-up part, like how technology has outpaced the law, because it has in so many different ways. I mean, while we were talking about that, I was thinking like, yeah, that's a very good point. On the other hand, we suffer from not having tech companies weighing in any way, you know, when it comes to our political processes, because they happen there, and something needs to be, you know, you would have a political ad being singled out for some, you know, some scrutiny by Facebook when it's in English and recognizable as political ad. We won't even have that because we're on the periphery of that, you know, of that event. You know, in a historical sense, the event of Facebook deciding to regulate political ads. So that's it's like damned if you're recognized and damned if you're not recognized by the tech platform as a subject of that process. So I think we are a bit over time. We need to finish, and this could probably go on for hours, days, and weeks and months. The conversation about this, but. To the point of the you know, all the things that were scratched on basically in this conversation, I would like to finish with emphasizing the need for conversation again and again, because that is definitely something that I think is lacking in some substantial and meaningful way. And in that sense, I really thank you all, the lovely panelists and the people who jumped in on the call. It was very inspirational. I hope it was interesting and inspirational for you as well. And I'll turn over to our wonderful host now.
Thank you, Tijana. Thank you to great panelists, and also all of you who were very active in the chat. I hope this is, I mean, you're always saying that. I hope this is not the last time we're talking about it, but like, I'm sure this is not the last time, because this is an ongoing discussion and it's super important. I learned a lot myself. I want to thank Anna Kuliberda again, who is a co-host here and a long cooperator of the personal and a good ghost of the Personal Democracy Forum as well. Here, remind you about the a newsletter that you can follow what we're doing under the Personal Democracy Forum. So the next calls, and it's still open. I mean, we don't have a set up agenda for the rest of the year. We're trying to meet with you with great panel and bringing you great panelists on a lot of topics in the wide, broadly understood connection between democracy and technology. So if you have an idea, just write to us. Thanks again to National Endowment for Democracy, of course, and the big thanks to Tijana, because she was also I would say a main organizer of this discussion. So thank you for this. Anna, you want to say something at the end?
I would love to thank you, everybody who stayed with us a bit over time. We promised 7:20. It's 7:30. It's amazing to have so many voices in such a almost loud discussion. This is exactly what we wanted. Thank you, Eliska and Alexey, for being really discussing issues and bringing new perspectives. For me, I learned really a lot. So it was fantastic to have you. And for our keynote, that was great to have a perspective that is outside of Central and Eastern Europe, that is outside of European Union as well. I think it was a bit of fresh, strange, but a fresh air. And Tijana, it was a great choice having you as our host and moderator. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
And thank you to Mark Zuckerberg, because without him, probably we will have nothing to talk about. Saying that, yes, thank you so much to all of you, and hope to see you soon on the PDFC talks or on the other occasions.
Have a good evening.
Good luck and keep up the good fight.
Bye.
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 Bye.